A mass grave has been found outside Izium in eastern Ukraine, days after the city was liberated. Authorities say it's one of the largest burial sites found in any city recaptured from the Russian army, and that soldiers and civilians are buried there.
A pine forest hiding a horrific mass grave. Ukrainian soldiers have found more than 400 bodies buried near the city of Izium after it was freed from Russian control. Here lie the bodies of 17 of their comrades, surrounded by hundreds of individual graves with only crosses to mark them.
We only found this place because Russian soldiers posted a video online. On the cross, it says there's 17 bodies, but on that video, there were more. We have not counted them yet, but I think there must be at least 25 or 30 bodies. Maybe this is not the only mass grave here. We now have to work and identify everyone who died here.
Earlier this week, President Zelensky raised the Ukrainian flag in Izium. The city had been under Russian control for more than 5 months. It now shows scenes of destruction, and people are without running water, electricity, or heat. Zelensky said an investigation would follow the findings in the forest.
We want the world to know what is happening and what the Russian occupation has led to in Bucha, Mariupol, and now, unfortunately, Izium. Russia is leaving death behind it everywhere and must be held responsible. The world must bring Russia to real responsibility for this war. We will do everything for this.
Ukraine aims to reclaim all its territory after retaking Izium. However, Russia still holds around a fifth of the country.
Well, our correspondent Nick Connolly is in Kharkiv and says Ukrainian authorities now face the task of piecing together the circumstances behind those mass graves.
Well, definitely, there is little to say that somehow those Russian troops who were in Izium for 5 months, we heard there, would somehow have behaved very differently to what we've previously seen close to Kiev, a place like Bucha, and in terms of the way they behave towards civilians. Has to be said, though, there are reports in the Ukrainian press right now that it is believed at least a part of these bodies belong to people who lost their lives during shelling of the city. These things take a long time. When you think back to the spring when those cities closer to Kiev were freed, were recovered by the Ukrainian forces, it took weeks and weeks for the Ukrainian authorities, for all the kind of judicial organs to get involved, to do those DNA analysis of the people there, and also to try and track down their relatives. It's important to remember lots of people from this part of Ukraine have either fled deep into Western Ukraine or to Europe or to Russia. So trying to find out and reconstruct who these people were and how their last days look like is a very long process. But definitely that is the fear, that as this Ukrainian counteroffensive takes and secures more territory, they're going to be finding people everywhere they go. I was close to the Russian border yesterday, and the locals there were pretty much sure that in the forests around they would definitely still be finding lots of people who lost their lives trying to get out, trying to get to Ukrainian-held territory. Also, they were sure that there were bodies of lots of Ukrainian soldiers, maybe prisoners of war, that they believe might have been mistreated by the Russian forces in that part of the country. So lots of gruesome discoveries expected here in the days and weeks to come.
Right, and the Ukrainian counter-offensive, how have Ukrainian forces been able to maintain their momentum?
It is ongoing. Obviously, for now, the Russians have been able to kind of take up more stable new positions using rivers and other bits of kind of the topography of this part of the country to make things easier for them to defend. And also now, we have seen that the Ukrainians have now hit Russian positions kind of southeast of Kharkiv towards Donbass, where the Russians are better set up, have more in the way of supplies and better trained troops. But this is ongoing, and we definitely have seen now that without this Kharkiv region, without this kind of way in to supply its troops in Donbass, Russia's having real trouble, and we're seeing Ukraine making real progress around the city towards Severodonetsk, that city that earlier in the summer was such an important but very hard-won victory for the Russians. So a sense that Ukraine is on a roll, but maybe the next couple of weeks are not going to be as easy and as fast as what we've seen in recent days.
Okay, thank you for that, Nick. Nick Connolly in Kharkiv. All those mass graves in Izium were discovered following sweeping advances by Ukrainian forces. President Zelensky says Kyiv's troops have recaptured around 8,000 square kilometres in the east of the country. The area in solid blue shows Ukrainian gains over the last 2 weeks, while the striped region is still held by Russian forces. We can look at this closer with Jenny Mathers, who's an expert in Russian politics and security and a senior lecturer at Aberystwyth University in Wales. Welcome to DW. How's Mr. Putin likely to react to these latest defeats?
Well, what's interesting is that so far he hasn't made any direct response. He's made no public statements about the Ukrainian counteroffensive, and he's really left it to other people to try and explain it away. And that means that there hasn't been any clear line from the Kremlin. So different spokespeople are saying different things, emphasizing, for example, that the military is simply withdrawing, regrouping, or blaming NATO, claiming that NATO forces are actually fighting in Ukraine, and calling perhaps for an acceleration in the attacks on Ukrainian civilian targets. So there's been a very diverse response from across different aspects of Russian sort of officialdom.
And does the lack of a response from the top tell us anything?
I think it tells us a great deal. I think it tells us that the Kremlin is in a certain amount of disarray and confusion, and perhaps in shock. They certainly didn't expect this, dramatic counteroffensive of great success and a humiliating defeat by their own forces in Ukraine. At every step of the way, this war has not gone the way that Putin and his supporters have wanted it to. And so, perhaps he's hoping to just get on with his other business and then, hope for better news to come.
So, given what you've said about that disarray, politically, is Mr. Putin still the untouchable strongman at home that we presume he was when he started this war?
Well, that's very interesting because so much of Putin's strength comes from reputation and comes from other people's responses to him. And once there's evidence that that strength is perhaps not quite what we thought it was, then the whole edifice begins to crumble and is certainly very vulnerable. And he's been, not he personally, but the regime has been the subject of very harsh attacks now from the more hardliners in Russia, the nationalists, the people who are ultra extreme in their views in terms of their support for the war and really want more destruction in Ukraine and more bloodshed. And they've been very critical of the Ministry of Defense and the generals for the way that they waged the war. And they've called upon, a national mobilization of the country, of the economy, of the armed forces, and so on, which is definitely something that Putin has been trying to avoid. So he is vulnerable, I would say, to these kinds of attacks and pressures from the nationalists and the hardliners.
Right. And a quick word about his meeting yesterday with the Chinese leader Xi Jinping in Uzbekistan. How important is that relationship now that Russia is so isolated from most of the rest of the world?
It's really vital as far as Putin is concerned. He wants the world, and particularly the West, to see that Russia has strong friends, that Russia is close to China, because, of course, China is, apart from the U.S., the leading power in the world. And so, Russia wants to be sure to be seen to be close to China. China, however, has been quite careful in its relationship with Russia during this war. It hasn't provided, direct, clear support. It hasn't provided direct, clear condemnation. You're sort of trying to walk the line. And so I don't think that President Xi of China is going to give Putin everything that he wants by any stretch.
Thank you so much for that. That's very clear. Jenny Mathers from Aberystwyth University.